I wanted to talk to you because you have been writing some really interesting things lately in response to not just some major decisions by the Supreme Court, but a lot of different dynamics that are going on that seem to me to be very interesting and compelling, but also things that, for a lot of different reasons, the main majority portion of our media in America doesn't seem really willing to grapple with. Mm-hmm. Before we get started talking about some specific things, why do you think it is overall that we have a conversation about these topics here in America that always seems to be kind of going past the point? It doesn't really want to grapple with the alternate view.
That's a good question. I think there are a number of factors at play. Obviously, the increasing polarization of our media, I think, is one of them. I also think part of it, honestly, is just there's a reluctance or inability to, I like the word you use, grapple with issues that have sort of a heavy moral substance. And particularly when it comes to abortion, you see this most clearly in the default of always going back to euphemisms and cliches. So it's everybody talks about choice, but they never complete the circle and say choice to do what specifically. So even people who brand themselves as having, courageous or uncomfortable conversations never really complete the process and say, we're talking about a woman's choice to intentionally end the life of her unborn child. Because if you do that, then that opens up a very different conversation. But as long as you can, keep the language in terms of reproductive justice or bodily autonomy or just choice specifically, then you can avoid having some of those conversations. So I think sort of corporate media on both the left and the right defaults to those positions because they're just a lot easier to have because for one reason or the other, we're at a point in American history where discussions of public morality are very difficult for people to have. Our discussions tend to focus more on things of a material nature. So even to set aside abortion, and I'm sure you noticed this, our conversations about crime, particularly in big cities, it's all about access to resources and services. It's not about what is right or wrong. It's about what people don't have and why what they don't have causes them to pursue a particular action. And abortion ends up being the same way. It's, well, if you were really pro-life, you would vote for big government in all these ways, right? Universal health care, universal child care, universal daycare, maternity leave, so on and so on and so forth. So it's always about the material and never about the moral.
Mm-hmm. There's one aspect of this that's really kind of stunning when you think about it. There are all these different voices that exist right now outside of the corporate media conglomerate. Now, I'll use one who exists within it as kind of a starting point, which is Bill Maher, who's always put up as this person who will wade into territory where others won't go because he has such a powerful fan base, contract, tenure that he can say things that other people don't. But he's basically the exception that proves the rule in the sense that most of the people who wade into these territories, have support systems that exist outside of the traditional media marketplace. So they feel like they have more freedom to say things. But that cohort is also one that seems to have views that are essentially the same as the corporate media world when it comes to an issue like abortion, where they don't seem willing to cross that line and grapple with the questions that you're talking about. Why do you think that is, given that they kind of make it a part of their branding we're the truth tellers in an era when media is compromised by left and right and the like?
I think a lot of this comes down to worldview. And there's certain, and I write, anyone who follows my writing understands, I write about my faith a lot. I sort of frame these positions within a biblical worldview, but everyone has a worldview. And the notion that there can be such a thing as separation of church and state, or more specifically, the separation of religion and politics is fooling themselves. Everyone has a worldview. It's just that some people are more open about their evangelism and I mean, they'll put unbelievers to the sword with a quickness that some Christians could only dream of, right? So a person like Bill Maher, he gets certain things right. He understands that a man is a man and a woman is a woman, but his broader sort of overarching worldview is one in which he feels people should be able to do what it is that they want, define themselves in ways in which they want. He just draws a line in a different place. So he says, okay, if you call yourself a man, or if you call yourself a woman, but you're really a male, I'll respect you. I'll use your pronouns. I just don't think you should be in the girls' bathroom or competing against women in sports. And he thinks that that's going to buy him some favor amongst the people who see sex and sexuality, who treat those things as a false idol. But what he doesn't realize is that he's going to get burned at the stake just like I would, because he refuses to bow to all aspects of that particular worldview, and he'll get treated as a heretic just the same. So I think all of these things come back to what people believe about the nature of truth, about the author of truth, about the author of justice. What is it? I mean, Matt Walsh's question, what is a woman? Yeah, it's sort of, kitschy and punchy, but it's a real question. And, generations ago, kids in Philosophy 101 was just like, well, what is the nature of good and evil? What is man's purpose? We have a different question. And it's one that a lot of people are unable to answer because their particular worldview holds their feet in a particular position. And you see that in the things that they say and do.
Maher's position reminds me of Churchill's line about begging with the crocodile to eat you last.
Right, exactly. Exactly.
So you've written very compellingly, and this is a thread that runs through your writing, but one of your latest pieces was about this, about the way that the corporate world and media conglomerates kind of frame the abortion issue, particularly targeted at Black women, in a way that is designed to basically give them an argument that abortion is better for you than being in a traditional marriage or having a what we would have considered a traditional life until the past couple of decades. This seems to me to be something that people are really waking up to a lot more, especially in terms of that cohort of the right that is skeptical of how pro-business a lot of conservative policies have been, that basically people are treated like, they're cogs in a machine.
Right.
And that the addition of kind of family life is just something that corporations aren't really that interested in. It seems to me both true, but also short-sighted from the perspective of corporate America. Why do you think we got to this point as a country, given that traditionally, a lot of these entities, until it feels like, just the last few decades, were, generally considered more pro-family or pro-family formation as a form of stability?
There are a lot of forces at play that involve, as you laid out, big business, right? Corporate America, corporate interests. There's a mix of feminism in there. Sort of the racial justice issues and how those have morphed. And as I said, it's complex. One thing I know for sure is that the way abortion was framed in previous generations, right, it was seen as a way for women to have pursuits, both of a sexual and of a professional nature that can more closely mimic men. So abortion is sold as a way for women to have, quote unquote, consequence-free sex. I put that in air quotes because, when my granddad went out to plant corn in the morning, when he eventually reaped that corn, he didn't call it a consequence of his actions. It was sort of the natural byproduct, right? Mm-hmm. You sow, you reap. So you sow sex, you reap babies. It's reproduction is central to the act. But one of the things that ended up happening is that what I think what originated as sort of the pursuit of the sort of suburban middle-class white woman who want to be able to work in the newsroom or write editorials for Salon or The Atlantic, has now been transformed into another plank of the racial justice agenda. And it's the most perverse thing ever, because in any other situation where you have an organization that has historical racism baked into its founding and through its founders themselves, where this organization's actions have a disproportionate effect on quote unquote people of color, specifically Black people, that organization is shunned, right? Sometimes people will just make up racist history and say, oh, we shouldn't associate with this particular organization because of its racist past and its racially disproportionate president. But for some reason, we don't hold Planned Parenthood to that standard. Margaret Sanger is given a pass, even though in New York City, where Planned Parenthood got started, about 50% of Black women's pregnancies end in abortion. Now, if someone's willing to stand flat-footed and tell me that more Black babies being born into the world is an act of white supremacy, I'm all ears. But what they do, they put fertility clinics in the middle-class white neighborhoods, and they put abortion clinics in the low-income Black neighborhoods, and then they call that racial justice. So the corporations are included because they need a workforce, and they know that women with children tend to have their attention diverted for some period of time. And honestly, Ben, it's just a lot cheaper to pay a woman to kill her offspring than it is to pay for maternity leave and everything else that women would need in that particular period of time. And then the corporations know that when a woman has a child, right, and she comes home to care for that child, there's a chance that she may not come back. And even in my own life, after my wife and I had our third child, we changed some of the things that we were doing, because she worked as a social worker and we were paying basically a mortgage to childcare. And we realized you get paid to take care of somebody else's children. We pay someone to take care of ours. Why are we including the middleman, right? Let's just remove them and get back to ordering our lives in a way in which people did for millennia. So I think the corporations have a vested interest in ensuring that women stay as closely tethered to their organizations as possible. And this is why feminists love any discussion of women managing large, complex organizations, as long as it's not their own home. In the same way, they love to celebrate educators and women who engage in childcare, as long as it's not their own children. So all of these things sort of are melded together and have brought us to where we are right now.
There's an aspect of this that tends to lead to an argument toward Western decadence. And it's something that I'm critical of, even though I understand the basis for why certain people make this argument. But just to try to sum it up fairly, it basically goes, Enlightenment values have failed. We've reached a point where, a child is viewed as a luxury good. And, say what you will about Russia or China, they don't, have the same issues when it comes to pretending that boys can be girls as we do and that kind of thing. Therefore, the West can be judged as decadent, and all those Enlightenment values, it took them a while to be disproven, but they've been disproven. We have to move on to something else. That strain seems to be much louder today than it has been at any point, at least in my paying attention to the political discourse. What's your response to that argument as you see it?
I mean, I think there's a lot of truth there, right? Freedom and liberty are tremendous values, but they have to be used for a particular end, right? So even I wrote a piece the other day on Friday. I talked about the great separation, is how I frame it, within the black community, within Black political discourse. And the crux of it is simple, right? It's that slavery, Jim Crow segregation, legal second-class citizenship, both created and fortified what we know as the Black community in this country for hundreds of years, right? So one drop meant you were in that category of didn't matter what you chose, we chose it for you. But what freedom has done, and the misuse of freedom specifically, it has allowed people to pursue things in the name of liberty that work against their own self-interest, against their ability to form loving, strong, stable families. So that's why, going back to what we were saying before, abortion is now being touted by the NAACP and the sort of black evangelicals who are operating who see themselves as taking up the mantle of Dr. King. These people are now saying that abortion is a human right and black women need more access to it in order to be sort of free participants in our democracy, because they don't understand freedom. You're free from something to pursue something. So to the extent that in the West, our freedom is being used to pursue sort of a subversive worldview or moral perversion, to be quite frank, right? I'm sure you saw all of June. Every other day, it was a new child-friendly drag queen, event. And not just in San Francisco, in Texas, right? In places that we consider conservative. But if that's the end game of freedom, then we are sort of tempting fate. And I wouldn't be surprised if we talk about the West in the past tense in another generation. So I think there's something to that. To me, what underlies it is the fact that it is much more difficult to maintain a moral standard, or it's much easier to maintain a moral standard in a society where nothing is allowed than it is in one where everything is permitted. And we live in that society right now. And you've seen, I've said this before, like the Overton window has shifted right in front of our children's bedroom. So now to be a conservative is to basically keep those people that want to come into it at bay. So I think there's some substance to that. I'm not a doom and gloom person. As I said, I'm a Christian, so I have an eternal hope. But I haven't seen the left say at any point in the last 5 years, okay, guys, I think we've gone far enough. Mm-hmm. The boundary is constantly being pushed. So to the extent that, other cultures, China, Russia, Africa, some parts of South America, wherever, to the extent that they say, no, we take a very different approach to marriage, to family, to child rearing. Even, Ben, I'll bring this up, even the way we approach the elderly, right? Mm-hmm. In the West, and particularly in America, it's your mom gets a certain age, you put her in a home. In other parts of the world, it's you have multi-generational households where you have the nucleus, right? Man, husband, wife raising their children. And then you also have mom or dad there. And then you have the benefits of that intergenerational knowledge transfer. You have the benefit of youth and vigor with the children, combined with wisdom and experience with the elders. That's the norm for a lot of people across the world. But that sounds strange to us because we see both the very young and the very old as burdens and drags on our actual, on what we see as our highest pursuits, which is at all times, economic gain.
Part of the issue that I would use to respond to the arguments of the people that I mentioned is to say that I feel like looking to these authoritarian approaches is a cop-out. Because it basically says, freedom, we're giving up on the idea of individual freedom, individual liberty, because we no longer have faith in the ability of or desire of Americans to form families, to live as neighbors, to participate in a faith community in a real way. Not spirituality, but an actual faith community. And to do all the different things that you mentioned, which Americans have historically done for most of the existence of the country. It's not like, it's not like you had lots of people getting put into homes, a century ago. And yet in this modern economy, we've shifted things around to such a degree that it's now just assumed that that's what you do, with all sorts of malign and terrible, after effects when it came to COVID policies, particularly in New York. To me, it seems like what's really needed here is less a rejection of what we might broadly describe as Enlightenment values, and more a rediscovery of the essential nature of an ethic guided by natural law and faith and having the right priorities, that has been essential to the American experience, in the sense that it wasn't just Enlightenment values; it was the fact that we had a crazy Puritans. It was not just that we had sort of one aspect of this from the old world. We also had this recurring religious revival. We had recurring sort of injection of faith communities and communities based on both like ethnic background and tradition and priorities, and that was actually not just something that was incidental to America's success, but that it was actually key. The problem is that's something that people have to do themselves.
Correct.
You can't just like flip a switch and make that happen. And electing a president certainly won't make that happen like one way or the other. That's kind of my response. So what do you think about that? Is that a response that is valid, or is there something there that I'm missing?
I'll say a couple of things. One, I agree with you. I don't think the answer is to turn to authoritarians, right? But that is a possibility if we continue on this track, because, I see the flag obviously displayed prominently behind you. And when Adam said that this Constitution is meant for moral and religious people and is wholly unfit for any other, a lot of us quote that. What we don't ask is, so what happens in a post-moral and anti-religious society? So where you have no self-governance, small s, small g, right? Where a person can't even regulate their own emotions, where they can't have a dispute even with a family member without having to call the police, right? Where we can't regulate ourselves, someone else is going to step in and fill that gap, or at least there are going to be clamors for someone else to step in and fill that gap. And I think that is why you see, that part of the right that's bubbling up that sees big government in its sort of narrow and tailored manner, being able, or thinking that it is able to sort of prime the pump and push the population in a more positive and sort of morally sound direction. Now, I'm not sure if that's possible or not, but I will say this. If we're going to have big government, I'd rather it pay for what it wants than get what it pays for. So I'd rather sort of a Hungarian style. If you get married, here's $500. You have a kid, here's $500. Every anniversary, here's $500. If you go through marriage counseling in a particular year and can prove it, here's $500. Than to say to unmarried women, if you have a kid out of wedlock, here's $500, and then get upset when the rate of non-marital births explodes in every demographic since 1965. So I agree with you. I don't think the answer is Russia or China or building an authoritarian nation state. But one of the problems is if you have no center and you have no guardrails, as the wheel spins, right, the spokes are just going to fly off. You have nothing holding us. And our center was assumed at one point in a thoroughly Christianized nation, right, where you had 10 commandments, you had public prayer, you had prayer before congressional, like actual prayer, not amen and women before congressional sessions. The center was assumed. So even if you were an atheist, there were certain things that held the society together. But when you release that and say every man is his own judge, you get trouble. And that's how you get someone, and I don't mean to pick on him, like David French saying that Drag Queen Story Hour, right? And I know he'll make a nuanced argument about the First Amendment. But when you link Drag Queen Story Hour and then you finish with blessing of liberty. Your entire project is on shaky ground, and I think we are starting to see that. And the question is, how do you rebuild from the rubble in which we currently exist?
There's a moment that I recall from this is now 11 years ago when there was that brief kind of rise of Rick Santorum that took people by surprise in the Republican primary. And I was having a meeting at the time with one of the prominent Tea Party groups that was more libertarian minded. And I remember making the argument that they did not buy or they did not necessarily agree with, saying, you know, you all should sound a lot more like Rick Santorum when it comes to the way that families form, because that's the only thing that keeps us from having big welfare states,
correct?
You know, enormous entitlement systems and the like. Because if you have those strong family units, if you have those strong neighborhoods, then you don't need the huge police union, and you don't need the huge, you don't need all of the entitlement forces that go in and skew the system and make your taxes go up and all these other things that you complain about, because people are actually there to help each other. And we have, we've just started treating people like units, it seems to me,
yes.
As opposed to as people. I do want to get, before we wrap up here, to some of the conversation that has been taking place that I know you've written about, and I've observed with some real disgust in the past month or so surrounding Justice Clarence Thomas,
yes,
who's been at the center of so many of these opinions and is viewed with such contempt by the left for a lot of different reasons. I have to say, I've seen a lot of pretty disgusting racial language from the left over the years about major figures who have broken with what they view as a population that should be lockstep, obviously more directed at Black Americans than Hispanic Americans, though there is an increase now in the those crazy Latinas,
right.
And that
far
kind
right
of thing.
Latinas, right.
Yeah, far right Latinas. From my perspective, they don't even know what they're talking about. Correct. There, man. They're so much more further right Latinas they haven't even met. But anyway, when you look at the situation and the treatment that Thomas has gone through,
yeah,
what is your reaction to it?
So I put my reaction to paper a few weeks ago, and I mean, it's really simple. I think that the left is angry at Justice Thomas because he represents the dignity and self-respect that they try with all their might to steal from Black Americans. And when I say that, let me be specific. The left's position on race is that white people do things, right? They can be held responsible for their own behavior. And Black people have things done to them, and we cannot. So a white guy who comes from a long line of bigoted Klansmen or neo-Nazis and gets jammed up for committing some crime, he is seen as being responsible for his behavior. There may be some acknowledgement, his granddad was a grand wizard or grand cyclops or whatever. But when it comes to a Black kid, born into a family of, Crips or Bloods or whoever, it's his environment, it's his neighborhood, it's his school, it's opportunities that disappeared. And what that does, it creates a racial hierarchy that's based on who is able to be a moral agent, that the left wraps in the language of racial equality. And what Justice Thomas does is he rejects that entire hierarchy, which is why he's against affirmative action, because he knows that you can't claim to be equal in a society where you're constantly being judged by different standards of performance and behavior. So even though, again, the left speaks the language of racial equality and racial justice, it enforces the reality of racial hierarchy. And they see him as someone who refuses to play ball. And I've likened this in some respects to how modern men have difficulty dealing with, so-called independent women. Because when you've been told all your life that someone must and should depend on you for their sort of economic, social, and relational benefits and progress, when they turn to you and say, you know what, I don't need you.
Mm-hmm.
I may want to be in relationship with you, but notice the operative word. I want to. I don't need to. A lot of guys don't know how to handle that. And they get angry. And they start calling women names. And they start saying, B or this or that. Mm-hmm. And I think the left does the same thing with black folk. Because white liberals have been told from their birth that it is their responsibility to improve the condition of black America, right? They say, well, my ancestors did X, Y, and Z. Now, I grew up in New York City, so most of these white people don't have ancestors from the Confederate South, right? They're from Germany or Italy or, the Irish. But they take it on. In becoming white, quote unquote, they take on that intergenerational responsibility. So they see a guy like me or Justice Thomas who says, you're not responsible. Like, I'm responsible for how my kids are raised, not you. And they don't know how to deal with that. And they resent it. And their resentment materializes in the types of vicious racial insults, the Uncle Clarence, the Uncle Thomas, from both white and black liberals, Samuel L. Jackson and so on and so forth. So I think they're showing their hand. I think they're showing their true nature. Now, I'm not, and I want to be clear because a lot of people get this confused. I'm not the type of person who's identified as conservative, right? I'm not the type that talks about blacks on the Democrat plantation. I don't do that. But I do understand why some people do engage in that type of rhetoric. And it's not because black people are slaves. It's because Democrats and liberals and leftists act as if they own us. So when they see someone walking away, again, not to use that phrase, but when they do see someone walking away, they act as if they have ownership rights over us. And they said, no, your mind belongs to me. Your body belongs to me. Your tongue belongs to me. And someone like Justice Thomas threatens that entire regime because, Ben, you know this, you're in politics knee deep. If Republicans get on a national elections in a generation are getting 20, 25, 30, 35% of the black vote, Democrats will never win another election because Hispanics are already trending in that direction. Asians are trending in that direction in certain local races, New York City being one of them. But if that last black domino falls and they can't command 90% of the black vote the way they have in the last couple of generations, our entire political landscape is going to look different. So this is one border patrol that they are interested in, and is policing the borders of culture. And they use those vicious insults so that people who think like Clarence Thomas, because he stood his ground like a champ for the last 30 years. Most of these people can't even take 30 seconds of public criticism, but they attack him because they know anyone who looks up to him is going to have to think twice about whether they want to weather that type of assault for an entire lifetime.
Last question before I let you go. When the decision in Dobbs v. Jackson came down, one of my initial reactions in conversation with a friend was to say, I think that people on the left are going to discover for the first time that a lot of people who they assumed were part of their coalition, who they thought agreed with them on this issue, that they actually never did. And I think that's going to be a shocking discovery for a lot of them. I think that's particularly true of the Hispanic and African American community and of a lot of other communities where there is a significant faith portion and that there's not, a level of buy-in for the shout your abortion message that we see so many embrace. How do you think that plays out?
So I think it's complex, and particularly within sort of the black Christian tradition, right? I draw a very sharp distinction between Christians who are black and conservative who rejoiced at the Dobbs decision, and black Christians, and notice I'm reversing the order in terms of primacy.
Yeah.
Black Christians who see the pursuit of social justice as the highest calling of the church, who lamented when Dobbs came down, and I could tick off a number of people by name, starting with Senator Raphael Warnock, who, ironically enough, pastors the same church that Dr. Martin Luther King did, Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, right? So people of his ilk, I think, are fully in bed with the left as it relates to abortion as their most, cherished sacrament, right? But there is a contingent of Black and Hispanic and, other voters who believe in the sanctity of life, and do not think that death is a more desirable outcome than growing up in poverty, or just not growing up in a middle class existence. And sometimes I'll ask people, particularly Black folks, I say, well, how many Black people do you think would be in this country if the only people who were encouraged to have children, grew up in a 2-parent, 6-figure earning household? Like, what do you think? Do you think Oprah Winfrey will be here? Do you think LeBron James? Do you think the long list of Black luminaries from, the 17th century to now would be here? So I think one of the things that we're touching on is that the future, I think, of American politics is going to be less about superficial identity and more about the types of values that bind people together. And you'll actually get a true, sense of diversity, because there's a lot more space for differences of opinion on the right than there is on the left right now. So I'm looking forward to that. As I said in my piece on Friday, in terms of the Great Separation, I have no interest in joining arms with the BLM radical feminist types that thinks that being Black in America, to be truly Black and liberated, is to kill off your offspring and promote gender confusion to kids. If Eric Adams wants a drag queen in every school, he'll never see my kids in his classroom.
Delano, thanks so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thank you, Ben.